Have you ever borrowed a fiver from a friend to buy a sandwich? You get your delicious lunch, and your friend gets a little piece of paper, or maybe just a mental note, that says, "You owe me." It's a simple transaction, a tiny IOU that keeps the world of friendship and sandwiches spinning. Now, I want you to imagine that. But instead of a fiver for a sandwich, it's $1 trillion for building a nationwide high-speed rail network, funding a healthcare system, or maybe just keeping the lights on in government buildings. That, my friends, is the dramatic, often confusing, and endlessly fascinating world of national debt. It's like the planet is running on a giant interconnected web of IOUs, and it raises a truly spectacular question. If everyone owes everyone money, who exactly is the world's ultimate moneylender? This isn't some dusty, boring topic reserved for economists in tweed jackets. No. This is a story about power, about promises, and about how modern societies function. It's a story that affects your life in ways you might not even realize, from the interest rates on your future mortgage to the funding for your local library. So, let's pull back the curtain on this grand financial mystery. Who are these mysterious creditors? Are they shadowy figures in a secret mountain lair, stroking a white cat and plotting world domination? Or is the answer much closer to home? All right, let's start with the basics. National debt, also known as public debt or government debt, sounds intimidating, but the concept is actually pretty straightforward. Think of a country's government like a household. Every year it has income, which it gets mostly from taxes, income tax, sales tax, corporate tax, you name it. This is the government's allowance. But it also has expenses, paying for the military, building roads and bridges, funding schools, running healthcare programs, paying the salaries of government employees, and so on. Sometimes, in a given year, the government spends more money than it brings in through taxes. This is called a budget deficit. Simple, right? So, what happens when you have a deficit? If your household expenses are more than your income one month, you might put the difference on a credit card. A government does something very similar. The national debt is the grand total of all the money the government has borrowed over the years to cover all of its past deficits, minus any amounts it has managed to pay back. But here's a crucial distinction that separates a government from your household. You and I have a finite lifespan. We have to pay back our debts before we, cease to be. A country, on the other hand, is theoretically immortal. This means it can manage its debt differently. It doesn't necessarily need to pay it all off. Instead, it can often just roll it over by borrowing new money to pay back the old money when it comes due. So, if the government is the world's biggest borrower, who are the lenders? Who is on the other side of this transaction, handing over trillions of dollars and getting an IOU in return? This is where it gets really interesting, because the answer isn't one single entity. The pool of lenders is vast, diverse, and surprisingly close to home. We can break them down into a few major categories. First, you have domestic lenders, which means people and institutions within the country itself. Second, you have foreign lenders, which includes other governments, foreign companies, and international investors. And third, you have a special category of international organizations. Let's start with the domestic lenders, because this is the part that blows most people's minds. A huge chunk of a country's debt is often owed to its own citizens and institutions. Think about it. Pension funds need a safe place to invest money to ensure they can pay retirees in the future. Insurance companies need to park their vast reserves in something stable. Commercial banks need a secure asset to hold. Then we have the foreign lenders. This is the category that gets all the headlines, especially when we talk about geopolitical tensions. Other countries buy a nation's debt for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it's a straightforward financial investment. If a country like the United States is seen as very stable, its debt is considered one of the safest investments in the world. So, how does a government actually borrow money from all these different people and places? It doesn't just walk into a bank and ask for $1 trillion loan. The primary mechanism for government borrowing is through selling bonds. A government bond is essentially a fancy IOU. When you buy a bond, you are lending money to the government. In return, the government promises to pay you back the full amount, known as the principal, on a specific date in the future. In the United States, for example, a significant chunk of the national debt is held by government trust funds themselves, most notably Social Security. That's right, the government owes money to itself. Beyond that, U.S. banks, pension funds, insurance companies, mutual funds, and individual investors all own trillions of dollars in treasury bonds. Let's look at another amazing example. Japan. Japan has the highest national debt to GDP ratio of any developed nation in the world. It's over 250%. From the outside, that sounds completely catastrophic. But here's the twist. Over 90% of Japan's government debt is owned domestically. The primary buyer is Japan's own central bank, the Bank of Japan, along with Japanese banks, pension funds, and households. This is why understanding who the bondholders are is so critical. A country that owes most of its debt to its own citizens in its own currency has a lot more control and stability than a country that owes a ton of money to foreign entities in a foreign currency. So, the next time you hear a scary headline about a country's debt, the first question you should ask is, okay, but who do they owe it to? The answer changes everything. Now let's talk about the part of national debt that feels like a global chess match, countries owning each other's debt. This is where economics and geopolitics get stirred into one big, complicated soup. When we talk about the U.S. national debt, for instance, the conversation inevitably turns to its largest foreign creditors, most famously China and Japan. Why would China, a strategic rival, lend trillions of dollars to the United States? Well, it's all about trade. For decades, China has sold way more stuff to the U.S. than it has bought from the U.S., resulting in what's called a trade surplus. This means China ends up with a massive pile of U.S. dollars. So what can they do with all those dollars? They can't just spend them all in China because their currency is the yuan. U.S. Treasury bonds are seen as the world's safest financial asset. By buying U.S. bonds, China not only earns interest, but also helps keep the value of the U.S. dollar strong, which in turn makes Chinese exports cheaper and more attractive to American consumers. This relationship, sometimes called financial mutually assured destruction, creates a strange kind of stability. The U.S. needs their money to fund its deficit, and they need a safe place to put their money. Some people worry that China could use its massive holdings of U.S. debt as a weapon, threatening to sell it all at once to crash the U.S. economy. However, most economists believe this is highly unlikely. If China were to dump all its U.S. bonds, the value of those bonds would plummet, meaning China would lose hundreds of billions of dollars. It would be like threatening to burn down your neighbor's house when most of your money is stored in their basement. Beyond individual countries and private investors, there's another set of powerful players on the global lending stage, the international financial institutions, or IFIs. The two heavyweights you've probably heard of are the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, and the World Bank. These organizations were born out of the ashes of World War II at a conference in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Their original goal was to rebuild the global economy and prevent the kind of economic chaos that had led to the war. The World Bank's primary mission is focused on long-term development and poverty reduction. It provides low-interest loans, grants, and technical assistance to developing countries for specific projects. The World Bank is like a long-term investment partner for the world's poorer nations. Its goal isn't just to lend money, but to fund projects that will create sustainable economic growth and improve living standards over decades. The International Monetary Fund, or IMF, has a different, more dramatic role. The IMF acts as the world's financial emergency responder. When a country faces a severe balance of payments crisis and no one else is willing to lend it money, the IMF can step in with a rescue loan. This happened during the Asian financial crisis in the late 1990s and more recently with countries like Greece, Argentina, and Pakistan. The IMF is the lender of last resort, but this help comes with strings attached, and they are very thick strings. These strings are called structural adjustment programs or conditionalities. In exchange for the bailout loan, the borrowing country must agree to implement a series of tough economic reforms. These often include cutting government spending, raising taxes, privatizing state-owned industries, and opening their economy to foreign competition. However, these policies are often deeply controversial, leading to job losses and cuts in vital public services. Alright, let's take a quick break from the serious stuff for some truly mind-bending facts about national debt that put the scale of all this into perspective. First, the sheer size of it all. The total global debt is currently over $300 trillion. To put that number in context, if you were to spend $1 million every single day, it would take you more than 820,000 years to spend $300 trillion. Here's a fun one. Who do you think was the first country to default on its debt? You might think it was some small, unstable kingdom. Nope. It was ancient Greece, around the 4th century BC, when about 10 Greek municipalities borrowed money from the Temple of Delos and then, well, just decided not to pay it back. Even powerful nations have done it. Spain defaulted a record 13 times in the centuries after Columbus, and France, on the eve of its revolution in 1789, was spending half its national budget just on interest payments. Now for a surprising fact about the biggest debtor of them all, the United States. While everyone focuses on the foreign holders of U.S. debt, like China and Japan, the single largest holder of the U.S. national debt is the U.S. government itself. As of recently, entities like the Social Security Trust Fund and other government accounts hold trillions of dollars of U.S. debt. This is what economists call intragovernmental holdings. So a huge portion of the U.S. debt is money the country owes to its future retirees and its own citizens. And one final tidbit to warp your perception of debt. Is it possible for an interest rate to be negative? Yes. In recent years, several countries, including Germany, Switzerland, and Japan, have sold government bonds with negative interest rates. This means that investors were literally paying the government for the privilege of lending it money. In times of extreme economic uncertainty, investors are so desperate for a super safe place to park their cash that they are willing to accept a small guaranteed loss rather than risk a much larger loss elsewhere. After hearing all these multi-trillion-dollar figures, it's natural to have a gut reaction. Debt is bad. It's a sign of irresponsibility, a burden on future generations, and a looming catastrophe waiting to happen. And sometimes it absolutely can be. If a country borrows recklessly to fund vanity projects or corruption, if its debt grows much faster than its economy, or if it borrows in a foreign currency it can't control, it can lead to absolute disaster. However, to say all debt is bad is like saying all fire is bad. Fire can burn your house down, but it can also cook your food and warm your home. It's all about how you use it. For a country, debt can be an incredibly powerful and necessary tool for good. Imagine trying to fight a major war like World War II purely on tax revenue. It would be impossible. Governments borrowed massive amounts of money to fund the war effort. Or think about responding to a once-in-a-century pandemic. Governments around the world went deep into debt to fund vaccine development, support unemployed workers, and keep businesses from collapsing. Furthermore, debt is essential for long-term investment. A government can borrow money today to build a highway, a bridge, a university, or a research lab that will generate economic benefits for decades to come. It makes sense for future generations, who will benefit from these investments, to help pay for them through the gradual servicing of that debt. When used wisely, debt isn't a burden on the future, it's an investment in it. The key then is sustainability. The real question isn't how much debt is there, but rather, can the country afford to make its payments without crippling its economy? So debt isn't inherently good or bad, it is a powerful force. So after this whirlwind tour of the world of sovereign debt, we come back to our central question: who do countries owe all that money to? And the big, shocking, perhaps slightly anticlimactic truth is that there is no single answer. There is no one person, no one country, no one shadowy global bank pulling all the strings. The ownership of national debt is a massively distributed and decentralized system. It's a complex tapestry woven from the savings and investments of millions of different actors, all with their own motivations and interests. The IOUs are held by a vast and varied crowd. The holders of the debt are, in large part, us. They are the pension funds managing the retirement savings of teachers, firefighters, and office workers. They are the insurance companies we pay to protect our homes and cars. In many of the world's largest economies, like the US and Japan, the biggest creditors are the country's own citizens and institutions. In a very real sense, the country owes the money to its own people, promising to pay them back from future prosperity. Of course, a significant portion is also held by other countries, creating that fascinating web of global codependence we talked about. Nations like China and Japan and the UK hold U.S. debt as a safe investment for their massive currency reserves. Ultimately, the global system of debt is a system of trust. It's a promise from a government to pay back its lenders, and the system only works as long as that promise is believed to be credible. The trillions of dollars in national debt are not just numbers on a screen, they represent the collected savings of the world, invested in the belief that countries will endure, economies will grow, and promises will be kept. So the next time you hear a politician talking about the national debt, you'll know the story is far more complex and interesting than it seems. The IOUs are in all of our hands, a shared stake in the stability and future of the global economy.